Who misses free and affordable ads and social networks without the anti-sex work rhetoric? Assembly 4 is a team of sex workers and technologists in Melbourne, Australia, aiming to bring back free and fair advertising and social spaces to the sex working community. They also give back to organizations based in harm reduction, sex work, and education. Stepping away from the clunky design of traditional platforms, their two products, Tryst.link and Switter.at, are refreshing and well-needed changes in both presentation and mission. Both are free to join and open to all. In the words of an A4 user, from the policies to the language to the advice and tips, it makes such a big difference to feel encouraged and supported instead of policed. Check out their website, assembly4.com, for the word and not the number, for more info. Welcome to the Peep Show podcast.
News and stories from the sex industry.
With Jesse and PJ Sage. Welcome back to another episode of the Peep Show podcast. This week we talked to Zahra Stardust and Gabriella Garcia about the panel they are organizing called Decoding Stigma, Designing for Sex Worker Liberatory Futures.
Hey, I'm Adrian, one of the hosts of After Adult Podcast. My porn name should be Mozart Fremont, but you probably know me better by my actual porn name, Siri.
I'm Rachel, but my porn name would be Woody 16th Avenue.
After Adult is a podcast about life and porn.
I don't actually watch porn.
I don't really watch that much porn either. I probably watch more than you, but I mean, most of the time it kind of would feel like going to work on my day off.
You 100% watch more than me, because I don't watch porn. Find us wherever you get your podcasts. Just search for After Adult.
Or visit afteradult.com and follow us on Instagram at afteradult.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Peep Show podcast.
Welcome.
Whew, I am tired and not totally with it today.
Why?
We just got our second dose of the COVID vaccine.
Yay!
Which, yeah, we are very excited about.
We're going to be able to enter the world of the living again soon, very soon.
But right now, I do not feel very much as part of the world of the living. I am tired and sick.
Well, that kind of like freaks me out a little bit because I don't think you were supposed to get sick until the second day.
Well, let's see what happens tomorrow. But especially because I got to get up early and teach.
I know.
You have stuff tomorrow too.
Yeah, I agreed to give this talk on a panel at a law school in the afternoon without even thinking about the fact that it was the day after my COVID vaccine. So I really hope that I sound smart in front of all of these law students and not like I'm totally out of it.
But the good news is that our interview for today was recorded earlier.
Before this.
When our wits were still about us. So we're certainly looking forward to bringing you a discussion of the Decoding Stigma project and panel that are coming up this week, which
this
is
Thursday, yeah.
Yeah, and it's also part of a much bigger conference. And the name of that conference is...
Decoding Stigma.
No.
I forgot what the name of the conference is.
Informal, criminalized, precarious. That's all about different sex worker issues.
Mm-hmm.
And that is sponsored by a bunch of different institutions, including Hacking Hustling and the Berkman Klein Center and a bunch of other things.
Yeah. So we're going to have a conversation with Zahra Stardust and Gabriella Garcia, who are working on the Decoding Stigma panel and project, and we are looking forward to that. That's what you're going to hear in this episode.
But before we get started with that, I guess we probably should take a few minutes to update everybody.
So happy April. It's a new month. We have, I don't think we've talked about this yet on the podcast, but we have rebranded. So we are still Peep Show, but we did a lot of thinking about what it is that we're trying to create here at Peep Show. And, Peep Show Media seemed kind of vague for that. And we decided that we wanted to change the name of our little thing that we have going on here to Peep Show Magazine, because after running the website for almost a year, it's going to be a year next month, we realized that what we are creating and what our hopes are, our aspirations for it is, an online magazine that encompasses this podcast as well.
Yeah, it has lots of different dimensions. I mean, we cover different news stories when we can, but we also have lots of essays and reviews and, different personal narratives. And you've done a series talking to folks about what they do, when they're not hustling.
Yeah. And we're hoping to bring in, kind of a monthly art exhibit on the magazine. So there's all sorts of things that we have planned for you, both on the podcast and with the magazine.
All of those things combined, we really feel like we've started to build Peep Show into a little magazine, and we've been really excited about working on that for the last year.
Yeah. And so, just to do a little bit of housekeeping before we get to the interview, this little magazine is a DIY operation. We would very much appreciate support. We have a Patreon. It's patreon.com/peepshowpodcast. And, any help there would be great. PJ and I, do all of the editing for the podcast or for the magazine. We do all of the editing for the podcast, the producing, everything. We are running this out of our house without any institutional support. So we would appreciate anything that you could contribute. We also, you can, our handles for Venmo and Cash App are still the Peep Show Media. We'll change that at some point. But yeah, feel free. And also, I keep plugging this, but we have a writers fund that doesn't give us money, but that gives us money to pay sex working writers to produce articles. We have 3 really great articles coming out this month from other sex working writers, and we've been able to produce really amazing things and kind of feed money back into the community. So if that's something that aligns with your values, we would love it if you contributed to the Writers Fund as well. And you can figure out how to do that on the website, or you could always reach out to us. We are very friendly.
And what is the website?
It is now peepshowmagazine.com.
That's right, peepshowmagazine.com. Come check out the newly branded website.
Yeah, and also our social media handles changed to Peep Show Mag on Instagram and on Twitter.
So,
and speaking of Patreon, I want to give a shout out to our $50 a month contributors, Liara Rue, Aubrey Hayes, and Radventure Frankie.
Yay, thank you.
Yeah, we love you guys. And we love all of our Patreon supporters. So thank you so much for those of you who've been there only for a month, those of you who've been there for 3 years. We have so many people who have been keeping us afloat, and we very much appreciate it.
Yeah, it makes Peep Show possible.
Yeah. Okay, well, why don't we go on to the interview?
Okay, let's do that.
Hello, this is Chelsea Poe from TroubledFilms.com. I'm here to tell you about getting access to hot BDSM, queer, trans, and dyke porn all in one place. With code PEEPSHOW21, you can get 21% off your next order from TroubledFilms.com. Again, that's code PEEPSHOW21, TroubledFilms.com.
We have Zahra Stardust and Gabriella Garcia with us today. Zahra is a former Hustler Honey, Australian Penthouse Pet, and Feminist Porn Award Heartthrob of the Year. Her PhD research explored the regulation, ethics, and interventions of independent queer and feminist pornographies. She's an activist, lawyer, and academic. She's currently a fellow at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society and a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Automated Decision-Making and Society at the Queensland University of Technology. So, hi, welcome. I'm glad you're here with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, and Gabrielle Garcia is a writer, performer, and poetic technologist. She's currently a postdoctoral fellow at NYU's Interactive Telecommunication Program, where her research focuses on the protection of radical self-expression, networked subcultures, and cybernetic intimacy. In creating Decoding Stigma, Gabriella is working to bridge the gap between sex work, technology, and academia. Decoding Stigma is the practical extension of her theoretical research on how whorephobia is embedded into tech design. Welcome, Gabriella. It's nice to have you here too.
Thank you so much. Looking forward.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit about how you two are working together right now.
Wow. Well, Decoding Stigma seems to have really been an organic response to a long needed conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And it was something that really just kind of came out of happenstance in which I had published my thesis last summer, and the kind of art director, Olivia Foldies, came and responded that this is something that she'd want to help with. And within weeks, I was in contact with Zahra and a few others in the cohort, and it just was like off running from there.
The art director, where are you doing the project?
Olivia Folds is at Parsons at the same time that I'm at NYU. Both of us are in New York, although everything has been done remotely, honestly. Mm-hmm. I think I had met Danielle Blunt from Hacking Hustling last February in a panel I had thrown at NYU's Tech for Social Good Day, mm-hmm. and only met Livia a couple months ago. But otherwise, everything that's been achieved has been done collaboratively from remote land.
Blunt is a friend of the show, and we've covered a lot of the work that they've done with Hacking Hustling. So it's neat to hear about the collaboration they're doing with you all as well.
Tell us about Decoding Stigma, what it is, where the idea came from, and what you all are looking to accomplish.
Wow, I feel like I need a little bit of Zahra in on this because it's constantly evolving.
But no, look, honestly, you go ahead because this is your baby project, and everybody should know that Decoding Stigma is your project. It's something that came out of your thesis and all of your incredible research. I will add that Blunt was also the connection that drew me to Decoding Stigma as well. I was had started my fellowship at Berkman Klein Center, and it was Kendra Albert there, who is a really amazing scholar at the Cyberlaw Clinic, who teaches a subject on trans rights and is doing all of this really incredible kind of advocacy and solidarity work. And they introduced me to Blunt, and then Blunt brought me in on Decoding Stigma. So that's how I got involved. And we've been having fortnightly meetings as part of Gabriella's residency in this project this year and working on a number of things. So yes, Gabriella, tell us about how it all originated, how it began.
Well, I honestly think that really is kind of the whole story. Like, these are things that could only exist because of our ability to connect in the digital atmosphere in whatever way that that manifests. Basically, it came out of this, this kind of theoretical research of looking at how whorephobia is encoded into digital media and trying to understand why, mm-hmm. especially because it seems like so much of the internet infrastructure has been formulated on money, literally just money that has been accrued from sexual labor. And so being connected across institutions and across different organizations was just something that just really manifested out of the pressure to answer these questions. And rather than looking into action in crisis-oriented organization, we really wanted to dream of a future because mm-hmm. there are so many able minds and able-bodied and just creative ideation that occurs from sex workers because out of necessity or just because out of pure desire, mm-hmm. Desire is the ultimate imagination, right? We wanted to push forward and take those who have been experiencing the most, those who experience the harms of technology first and worst, and take that as knowledge in order to create a more inclusive, more robust technology.
And I think that's what's really exciting about Decoding Stigma is that it takes sex workers' experiences as the baseline and recognizes that sex workers have a really unique positionality in the world through which we understand power and the state and organizing and respectability and politics. And from there, let's think about the future. I think so often we get stuck in crisis organizing, we get stuck in, trying to claim our rights from some kind of supposed benevolent state, or we get stuck kind of talking about all of the problems, and sometimes we don't take a moment to start and dream big for the future. So that's what I've really loved about Gabriella's project, is that there's been a number of workshops that have really helped the group to start to facilitate opening up the breadth of what is possible.
Yeah. So what are some of those things? Like what do you hope that the future looks like? I know that's a super big question.
Wow. Well, a lot of that just comes out of the questions that are asked by those that participate in our conversations, and they're questions that are generally ignored by developers and designers at this moment. Like, what does consent in technology look like? And this is a question that is only raised from those that have experienced non-consensual encounters or have had their data scraped unconsensually. And so Trademark Transparency Network and looking at surveillance technology. And that came out of those that are in sex work and sex positive communities being like, how do we establish a sort of consent model and really understand how surveillance is trademarked toward action? Another question that we looked at most recently was at how we can create peer-to-peer communication models that require both sides to have a handshake moment of I consent to be part of this conversation. I consent to have this conversation archived for the future, as opposed to be used for the sort of extractive capitalist model of trying to figure out how people are communicating in order to further them towards selling.
Yeah.
So these are just questions that don't occur unless you have been sort of, I don't want to say a victim, but you've been at like the pointy end of the stick of technology.
I want to kind of ask you if this is what you're talking about here, but I remember talking to Blunt one time about how we interact with each other and keep each other safe, and thinking about like technology and how we use technology, like in terms of ethics or like care for one another, like by, for example, using Signal or Proton Mail as like preventative things, not only for ourselves, but for other people. And is that kind of what you have in mind when you're talking about that?
Yeah, I'll just jump in and say definitely it is that kind of collective solidarity, looking out for one another. And I think that was what was really exciting about this workshop that we just did over the weekend with Jing about on their project, which is called Togetherness. And they were really thinking about consent and how we build in consent to not only thinking about the content that we share with one another, but also the platforms that we're using. So they're thinking about peer-to-peer consent and peer-to-server consent, and thinking about the servers, the infrastructure, the platforms we use, what we're investing in, and how our content is being archived.
It is starting from that place of mutual aid, of this by us, for us, but rather than responding with that, it's taking that as the base level and trying to build from there. What does it look like if we provide a space for that imagination to occur, that we're not just looking at cybersecurity responses because of data breaches for poorly designed technology, but just starting from the very foundational beginning and holding space to really imagine and then display that imagination in hopes that we will find investment in these projects and that we will be able to have the same ventured interest in actually creating this, and that sex workers are paid for their consultation and their knowledge in by experience for what was the move fast and break things era. Like, we can be at the next era at this point.
I just was going to ask if you could unpack that idea of move fast and break things real quick.
Move fast and break things is a Zuckerberg quote, Mark Zuckerberg, Facebook, if I need to unpack it a little further, which was basically taking the Communications Decency Act, Section 230. I'll unpack that a little further later. Zahra could actually do it much better than I can, coming from a legal scholarship, of basically try everything and then worry about apologizing or fixing it later. And this is the reason why that sex workers have been outed on Facebook by accident, because Facebook has connected their identity via a data scraping that exposed their email address. And so they didn't worry about the repercussions that they would have on users. They would rather build an audience fast enough to get more investment. And then, I guess, shrug their shoulders later.
Right.
To what degree, I'm not sure.
Yeah, I remember similar thing happening with the People You May Know algorithm, outing sex workers to like clients who were in sessions at the time, right? And being like, oh, you may know this person. You're in the room with them right now, kind of thing, right? And then being like, that's my real name. Oop,
And I mean, part of this problem is obviously like who is designing and what values are being coded into the design. And so if we have the values of Silicon Valley who are taking a white heteromasculinist approach to tech design, they're not going to foresee some of these issues that arise, which is why I'm really interested in what it looks like when sex workers are building things and making things, and what sex worker values might look like and how we might code them into the design. And one of the tools that we've been using, just to touch back on that idea of futures and liberatory futures, we had a workshop at Decoding Stigma where we used this oracle for transfeminist technologies, and we had Sasha Costanza-Chock and Joanna Baron come to talk us through the deck, which is this incredible deck that has like 4 different cards where you get assigned values, objects, people, and situations. And we had these small groups where we were able to use these oracle cards as tools to reimagine like how we deal with today's social justice issues using technology, and kind of rerouting technology or counter uses of technology that kind of address power and work in solidarity with one another.
Did you find anything interesting like through that exercise?
Oh, absolutely. First, it was just so nice to have a space. So we did it on December 18th, which is the day after December 17th, or International
Day for in violence against sex workers. Yeah.
Thank you. And it was just so considerate to gather around what futures can look like. And so Sasha is at MIT Co-Design Lab, and Joanna is at Coding Rights in Brazil. And so looking at this as sort of a global North, global South issue, and trying to include voices that are just not even part of this conversation is something that we're really trying to work toward. Because right now, most of our conversations deal with who has access to even have these conversations, right? Especially in the time of the pandemic, where it's only those who can access the internet, only those who are already on the right side of the digital divide. So just to have a relief and to have funny moments to discuss from the outset without considering where we are right now, but to think about ourselves, let's say 1,000 years from the future, and have the gratitude of the technology that was developed in response to a carceral state applied in that conversation was magical, and a way to connect in a way that's not desperation, but dreaming.
And to give you an example, so on the Transfeminist Tech and Coding Rights website with the Oracle cards, they've got examples of different innovations that people have come up with in workshops. And one of the things that we talked through in the group that's there on the website, and we can't claim credit for it, obviously, but it was this really cool idea of this knowledge decentralizer lipstick. And that was something that really stayed with me. So it was about when you kiss somebody, imagine if you were able to transmit knowledge to somebody when you kiss them consensually, and it could be this silent way of passing around knowledge for feminist resistance and care. And so it really, for me, it was like, okay, we can actually dream outside the box. For me, as somebody who had come from very kind of policy or legal perspectives, thinking about strategic ways to advocate for this or that or kind of practical changes, it was like really, it really opened up my mind to think big and think broad and imagine impossible things that then we could, work with data software people to actually potentially bring them into being.
Yeah, that's really interesting because, I mean, you're dealing with very real and immediate problems and like forms of oppression. But at the same time, like when you give us examples like that, makes me think, it's a very science fiction kind of imagining. And I think that's really interesting here. And what you're talking about is like the intersection of like, product development and design and like these immediate concrete material things on the one hand, and then this like kind of science fiction-y imagined future on the other hand. And it's interesting how both of those seem to be coming together here.
It's so important. Speculative fiction really informs a lot of the things that I do. And so I look toward people like Octavia Butler and Ruha Benjamin and Ursula K. Le Guin and Marina Zerkow, who are sort of recognizing that if you try to root imagination in what our current reality is, then you're not imagining. Mm-hmm. And that you really have to extend to this narrative of what does not exist, because it takes a dream for something to become a reality. I know that's such a cheesy thing to say.
Yeah.
And it's, and it's so annoying, especially because like the problems are real. Like they are, like, this is not like they're material and they're concrete and they're awful. And like, this is not to dismiss the violence. Mm-hmm. But if we continue to just dream within the violence, then all we can see is the violence. Mm-hmm. And also, it's just a place of reprieve. Mm-hmm. And the things that we hoped to do and continue to hope to do is give a sense of aftercare. Like, where do you go after the crisis organizing? Where can you just maybe not talk about it and be in a safe place? Or where do you receive the salve at the end? Like who gets to massage you after you go to the street protest? Because a street protest will always be necessary. Yeah, and it would be helpful to really give a place to dream and relax afterwards, knowing it's going to come again.
So I really liked this idea that came up a little bit earlier of like a sex worker ethics, or sex worker values, I think is what you said. But what do you think that sex workers can offer to technologists that like is not there right now?
Zahra, I'm giving you this one first.
Yes, great question. We actually did a cool article for the BKC Medium we can link to later, which was like, what can tech learn from sex workers, which was largely kind of laying out the problem and kind of posing ideas for the future. I think that this is a really generative space right now, and so much is happening. We're going to be discussing some of this at the event that we're holding next week, where I've asked all of the panelists to think about like, what are your 3 things for the future and what needs to be done to build sex worker liberatory futures. In terms of values, I have been doing some work on this with some Australian sex worker organisations, thinking about how do we distill values. And we did a consultation with Scarlet Alliance, the Australian Sex Workers Association, about what do you think our organisational values will be, and people came back with so many different ways of articulating values. I think one of the problems is that values have in the past sometimes within sex worker orgs been articulated as advocacy goals like decriminalisation, but that's not really a value. That's like an output that we're seeking. Or sometimes values are articulated in terms of like human rights or bodily autonomy or self-determination, which kind of aren't values either. But they have a whole history behind them that gives you a sense of like, okay, here's a range of different things that we believe in. And so I've been thinking about values in terms of things, I guess, like autonomy, things like collectivity, solidarity, transformation, values that are like guiding principles that help us to make decisions. And you always come back to those values where you're in times of kind of difficulty or trying to work out if you have a values conflict or like what path do you take, it's useful to return to those values. I don't know the answer to how we code those values into tech, but I think that there are people who are working on those projects, for example, who are trying to code values that relate to, creating new community standards for platforms. So the issue is, like there is rampant deplatforming, exclusion of sex workers from terms of service of a range of different social media platforms. So, groups like Lip Social and others who are looking at, well, how do we have a kind of sex positive approach to creating new community standards? I'm interested in looking at this more broadly to think, well, what does that mean in practice in terms of not only the community standards, but the terms of service, but also your decision making and your accountability processes, and how do you work in like anti-racist approaches, kind of disability justice approaches, the sex worker rights approaches. How do you work all of that into a whole of platform or a whole of tech design? I think that's really interesting, and that's why I loved hearing from Jing and their project about TogetherNet within the Decoding Stigma group, because they were thinking about it really at the level of infrastructure. And so I think there's so many different ways in which sex workers can have input from infrastructure to standards to accountability processes.
Zahra is showing how intersectional these matters are. And I think intersectionality is one of the base level values that are within this. And it looks like addressing the fact that sex work is not always a liberation action. Sometimes it's a survival action.
Right.
It looks like not harm reduction, but decolonization. And why are we in a circumstance that some people have to go toward sex work, even if it is not liberating for the fact of being a sex worker. It looks at borders. It's very metaversal in a way. It looks like a constant evolution of conversation, and recognizing that this is a complex conversation that is not necessarily just like, it is my right to have pleasure, but it is also my right to not be punished if this is the only way I could get out of a terrible situation.
Yeah.
And I really look toward the sexual subaltern, which is a term coined by an Indian legal scholar, Ratna Kapoor, to understand that it goes beyond this idea of like, for those that are already privileged to experience autonomy, and then recognizing that there are a complexity of feelings just to traverse the world. It just means a non-binary in all the conversations.
Yeah, and I guess that's interesting because, I guess because sex work serves as a sort of social safety net. Often, so many sex workers are at the intersections of multiple marginalizations. And so I guess like getting back to the point of like what sex workers have to offer in terms of values, I can understand why intersectionality would be, salient in these conversations.
And I think it's intersectionality, it's important to remember it's not just about identities, but it's about intersecting oppressions. And so I think what a sex worker lens brings is looking back up at the system and making sure that our politics is about transforming and changing the system, or opting out of the system, or building new systems, rather than just looking for acceptance or recognition within the systems. And a lot of the conversations I think we have now around the different ways in which people exchange sex, whether it's for money or in trade or in kind, and the different relationships that people have with them. So much of our organising, I think, in the past has been around sex workers' work and really advocating for, worker rights and recognitions. And I know you had Heather Berg on the podcast a little while ago, who has really exciting things to say about, we don't just want to be classified accurately. Like, that's not the end goal.
Right.
There's also a role about resisting work in this, and looking at the ways in which work is distributed, the ways in which care is distributed, the ways in which, healthcare and social security and dignity and shelter are all linked together, and we need to unlink those. And that's why I think, in thinking about values and missions, I've often gone to mission statements of organizations like the Sylvia Rivera Law Project, or even Hacking Hustling's mission statement, where it's really very much about, we don't want to just be part of the system. We're not looking for a place in the system. We need to transform the system. The system is the problem. And also thinking back to not only Ratna Kapoor's work on the sexual subaltern, also Michael Warner's work around kind of having a politics from below, and that we learn the most from the people who are most marginalized by those systems. I think those are really core part of sex worker ethics, and that's something where, if we took a design justice approach, we would be learning from those ethics and experiences to build something more transformative.
And honestly, just to take it back a notch, to go beyond the academic, is it's fantasy and survival at the very end of the day,
right, sex work,
and those are just fundamentals of ethic, not ethic, just fundamentals that can be brought to the tech space, is fantasy and survival. And so how do we reimagine design in technology and communications and whatnot, when we literally create from the bottommost need of creation? It can be so complicated by words and theory and practicum, but at the end of the day, those who need to survive will create.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a powerful point, and that is definitely something we can observe about sex workers, is that it's a very generative community. It's a community that's constantly being pushed from platform to platform, but also figuring out how to use platforms against the grain, how to design alternative platforms, how to sort of reimagine platforms and find the loopholes and work around the rules, and that is, I think, something that we've certainly witnessed through our years as sex workers, that that's that kind of change and innovation and rebelliousness is one of the constants within the sex work community.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point about that we're circumventing by necessity, whether it's by using different terms and language or symbols, to be able to exist without being deplatformed or without having our content removal. Things like that are constant ways in which people need to navigate the world, just in order to find one another and belong and access, vital resources and information. I wanted to say too about, I think it's exciting. What's exciting is sex workers being able to hold tech companies and their systems into account. And one of the big issues, I suppose, that has a lot of traction at the moment is around financial discrimination, and sex workers all around the world are making lists of companies, payment processors, banks, other financial providers who are failing to provide services to sex workers.
Right.
And we have lots of anecdotal information from sex workers about how we think we're being identified, so maybe through algorithms or malicious flagging, or if you have a unique business name, or if your service description outs you, or perhaps it's to do with the external links to other accounts, or the fact that you have a pseudonym and you can't verify your legal identities, all of these different ways in which we suspect it happens, but we don't have a lot of research into, to what extent is this process automated? Are they using keyword searches to pick up sex workers, or is it part of a fraud monitoring software that they're using? And who is creating this software? And how is that being designed? How much of it is actually automated, or is it about human oversight? And what we don't always have is that data that's necessary for sex workers to be able to understand what's happening and then to make claims, whether they're anti-discrimination claims, or look for settlements from banks and payment processors where they have been excluded. So I think I'm really looking forward to doing some projects this year where sex workers are kind of looking up at those systems and seeking to expose the mechanisms of those systems, especially because, for this issue, often the justification is that it's around compliance, with fraud and money laundering, crime, trafficking, prevention. But I think as sex workers taking a critical lens to that will be well, how are they understanding risk? How are they understanding compliance?
Right.
Sex work is not inherently risky. Are there different ways to have a more tailored assessment of risk that doesn't just have a blanket ban for an entire industry? And how could we build a system that actually gives people data so that sex workers, this is a classic thing for anti-discrimination complaints, is that often employers, for example, have all of the information in the records, and the employer just has a feeling about what's happened and a lack of documentation. So how can we design systems where sex workers have the data to be able to hold banks and payment processors into account?
Right.
So it's not just, that's just one example, but I'm interested in looking at how we can all kind of collectively bring our skills together to hold big tech into account for their rampant and systemic and their automated whorephobia.
Yeah, it's interesting. I just wanted to chime in. I was thinking as you were talking that we did an episode recently on banking discrimination against sex workers. And one of the people who contributed a story was Siri Dahl. And what she said, and I thought was really important, is that the story that we keep getting about why, all of our accounts are under scrutiny is because in terms of online work, is because we're high risk because of chargebacks. And she's like, well, but that's actually why all of the platforms take out huge cuts of our transactions, because they're the ones that are taking those hits, right? It's not us. And so it's we're being
it's essentially insurance, right? I mean, the industry has already essentially built an insurance program
around that. And so now we're getting 20, 30, 40, sometimes 60% of our profits taken out by the platform so that they can account for that. But then we're still also being told that our banks can be shut down and our funds can be seized because we're high risk for chargebacks, when actually we've already paid for that, And I think that that's something that's worth talking about and kind of bringing to light.
Well, this reminds me a lot of what Shibundo Iguatu is doing in thinking about platforms as landlords.
Yeah.
In that, they are absorbing the cost, those who are actually renting space on platforms are absorbing the cost that should be actually absorbed by the platforms instead. And so while the platform gets to defend itself monetarily against these issues in financial tech discrimination, it ultimately, once again, is on the back of the sex worker to pay.
Right.
And So I wanted to go back to these strategies and tactics, though, of like holding companies accountable. I think I'm glad that we talked like a little bit about the specifics of the kinds of discrimination that sex workers are facing. But I also think what's really interesting here is that you're working at kind of the intersection of law and technology. I'm just kind of interested in the strategies for holding these companies accountable. I mean, I imagine you could subpoena them to get, some of this information for how decisions are made. I imagine you could probably reverse engineer some algorithms in some way that's far beyond my technical knowledge. But like what? But I guess that's kind of what I'm interested in exploring. Like, do you have ideas about how we could organize to achieve that kind of accountability?
Yeah, look, the first thing I'll say is that we often place too much faith in law reform to deal with these issues, and it's an easy place to go, but an attempting place to go. But I think what we've learned from other movements like mainstream gay and lesbian politics, for example, and the really strong critiques of those movements that are coming out of queer legal theory by Dean Spade and Libby Adler and others, talking about, we need to kind of lose our faith in that the legal system is going to save us. So I'll just add that caveat at the beginning to recognize that, all of the colonialist issues with the legal system and the ways that it exists and the ways that it is not there to serve marginalized populations and rather to reproduce the status quo. We need to just bear that in mind. Having said that, I know that there is some work happening around strategic litigation. There's a sex worker legal service where I am. It's on Gadigal land of the Eora Nation in Sydney, Australia. It's part of the Inner City Legal Centre, and they've been looking at doing a class action of sex workers against payment processes. And so we've been doing some research into trying to work out different ways in which it happens and the worst offenders. And part of the issues are around where payment processes are based and the laws of their governing contracts. But another issue is the lack of anti-discrimination protections for sex workers. So we actually have some discrimination protections in different states and territories in Australia, but they're ad hoc and they're limited. So we have protection on the basis of lawful sexual activity in 3 different states. But of course, that's a problem if you're working unlawfully. And in most of those states, they have a licensing regime in which many sex workers are forced to work unlawfully because the cost of compliance is too high upon their safety. Right. And then we have in one state discrimination on the basis of occupation, which does leave some room for sex work. In New South Wales, there's actually a bill that's been proposed, and it's introduced at the moment in New South Wales Parliament by a Greens MP, which is a really specific discrimination protection on the basis of sex work, whether it's past or present, or your imputed attributes or your associations. And so it's very broad, and I think that's exciting, and that might get us somewhere. And so certainly this is something that we're thinking about. Gabriella and I are also teaming up with Lorelei Lee and Danielle Blunt to be part of this hustle economy workshop with Data and Society in a couple of months. And we're having a specific workshop on this about how we respond strategically through this. I mean, class actions is one idea, but to be honest, I think there have been some cases in which sex workers have successfully brought claims against payment providers here, but they're often hidden behind non-disclosure agreements. And I think maybe it's cheaper for banks to just simply pay out ad hoc settlement fees than actually change their policies. So for me, I think it's a bigger issue around a naming and shaming campaign and a media campaign because it's not justified. I think it's unlikely to be justified by legal compliance issues. And we know that's the same across many different platforms, terms of service. They have a kind of pseudo-legal rationale for why they're doing it, but actually it's not about compliance at all. It's just whorephobic policy. So I think there needs to be some kind of media and public pressure campaign to change that.
That's all really fascinating. Yeah.
It's so very true in that, like, listening to Cindy Gallup speak of Make Love Not Porn, that every time she has a meeting with a fintech company or whoever she has a meeting with, is the answer is, well, I want to do it, but I can't be the responsible party for turning others into this idea. And so it really does seem like it's on the cusp. It just really requires either ownership for accountability or, at this point, taking over. Like, it's honestly the only other response that I have. But it's just like, it's so odd that every response is like, well, I would do it, but people may judge me.
Right.
Which really does speak to the stigma problem.
Yeah, and I wonder, to what degree are the sort of trafficking narratives that exist and, things like that op-ed that Nicholas Kristof wrote recently about Pornhub, like, to what extent are those things kind of factoring into these PR fears of these companies? Like, do you think those kinds of things are contributing to this discrimination?
100%.
Yeah.
I won't speak on a legal behalf because Zahra has the expertise here, but public-private technology partnerships are such an issue when it comes to mismanagement of statistics and how those are being turned into technology policy.
And I'll just add that I've been speaking to Blunt about this recently because we've been putting together an article for porn studies, and I've been interviewing them about the work of hacking hustling and these proposals to change Section 230. And we've been talking about the ways in which none of them actually address the root issues. So all of the issues around human trafficking or non-consensual intimate imagery or child exploitation material. There's so many different ways to address those issues on social or other policy levels, through better sex education and relationship education, or through open borders, allowing people to migrate for the purposes of sex work, to give people translated visa information, to give people who have experienced labor exploitation, to give them victims compensation without having to assist police in their investigations, through labor rights, through a range of different avenues.
Honestly, it's really that, like, so much of policy depends on whorephobia, that and by suppressing the voices of those that are actually within sex work, it becomes easy to pass laws in all domains. This has been happening for hundreds of years in at least colonial society, that it's unquestioned. It's so. To just mention that the autonomy of bodies is within the construct of, like, anti-morality, you can pass a law in half a second. And so Facebook right now is actually, basically profiting from the fact that they now are supporting these public-private partnerships of anti-trafficking laws without regarding any of the voices of those that are in sex work consensually or through survival, in order to, once again, actually profit now from anti-sex work legislation. So what it really looks like is, why are certain voices are just not allowed to participate in the conversation?
Right.
When they can actually add a lot to the differential between trafficking and sex work? Why are certain companies actually profiting from that conflation?
Right. Yeah. I think that's been the theme of a lot of recent, like, sex work organizing and advocacy, because that conflation is so dangerous for sex workers.
And just to tie back to Chibundo's work, who Gabriella mentioned earlier, Chibundo is on our panel next week as well. Chibundo and I are working with Daisy Ducati on an article about racial capital underpinning Pornhub, and we're not looking not just at tagging and kind of the white supremacist grammar of tagging on Pornhub, but also this is something that Chibundo's spoken about a lot, about the ways in which Black trans women are calling out co-optation and extraction and the pirating and theft of their intellectual property by white-owned platforms. And so I think we need to really think about the infrastructure, the material infrastructure through which, Pornhub's business model is based on piracy and on porn extraction. And these supposed tech fixes like verification don't actually address the root of the issue.
Yeah, I know we're running up on time. So do you want to just quickly talk about the panel that you're going to do next week and when it is and how people can listen to it?
Yes, we would love to. So the panel is called Decoding Stigma. It's designing for sex worker liberatory futures, and it's being hosted by the Berkman Klein Center. It's actually part of a 3-part series, like a lunchtime series, so which is all about sex tech and the internet. So the first one is on Tuesday, the 6th, and Blunt is hosting that at Hacking Hustling. And so that one is about sexual gentrification, and it explores the role that sex workers play in building up the economic infrastructure of the internet. And then the second one is being hosted by Lorelei Lee at Cornell Gender Justice Clinic, and it's about sex worker activism and the experiences of exclusion from online space. And then the third one is our one on the Thursday. They're at 12 p.m. every day, and ours is looking towards the future and what a future might be like if it was designed by sex workers. So it's all part of a broader conference that Laura Lee has been an amazing in creating, along with Rachel Cure, and it's called Informal Criminalized Precarious, Sex Workers Organizing Against Barriers. It goes over 2 weeks. There's a range of different sessions on sex workers' work and anti-work, on sex worker migration, sex work in a transnational context, and also a panel on decriminalization campaigns in the US. So we can certainly share the links for that. But on our panel, we've got Gabriella, who's going to talk about her amazing thesis and the work of Decoding Stigma. We've got Chibundo, who is a PhD student in sociocultural anthropology, and their work is largely around the activism of Black sex workers and decriminalization and digital space. And then we've got Yin Q, who is who's a kink educator, and they do a lot of work with Red Canary Song, and they're also the founder and creative director of Kink Out, and they're going to be speaking about their new project, Body of Workers. So I think that's going to be really exciting, because we're going to hear about ways in which people are organizing to create safe spaces for sex workers on the future, to archive, to connect, to create together in ways that don't invest in surveillance capitalism.
Yeah, that sounds really great.
It's really exciting. We'll definitely be checking out all of those different events.
Yeah.
No, I'm just going to say, yes, please do come. The more the merrier. And something that's really exciting, I guess, that we should say about this is thanks to the tireless work of Laura Lee and Rachel Kuo and their phenomenal hustling abilities, we now have funding to pay all of our panelists. And that's something that's really exciting, because when we first started this project, we were looking to all of our institutions saying, do you have money? Do you have any funding for us? And the answer that just kept coming back was we don't pay honoraria, or we don't pay speakers' fees. And Lorelei has been an amazing hustler and basically advocated with these huge spreadsheets and rationales and justification documents for why we need to pay sex workers to be on panels, because of the risk, because of the expertise, and also why we need to pay for childcare, and why we need to pay for transcription, and why we need to pay for live translation, and a range of other different access requirements. So I think that's really important to note.
That's amazing. Yeah. So where can people find you two and your other work?
Oh gosh. Well, Decoding Stigma is at decodingstigma.tech. We try to keep it simple at Decoding Stigma as well, Instagram, and our very neglected, a very neglected Instagram as well as the Twitter. You can find my own personal work at Gabriella.
And the event is on the Berkman Klein Center website. So if you go to cyber.harvard.edu/events, or just Google Berkman Klein Center and go to the events page, it's one of the first events that's coming up next week. So that's where you can find information about that. You can also go to the Hacking Hustling website, which has all of the bios of the speakers and information about each event, and I think links to the Eventbrite as well, which is a great place for non-peers to donate if they want to pay a solidarity donation to attend the conference, but it's free for sex workers. And I think otherwise people can connect to me. I'm on Twitter and Instagram just under Zahra Stardust. My personal website is zahrastardust.com, and I'm also on the BKC and the QUT pages as well.
Nice. Thank you so much. It was really great to hear about the work that you both are doing.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yes, it was our pleasure.
Thank you for your long history of organizing in this space.
Oh, yeah. Thank you for saying that.
Thank you for joining us for yet another episode of the Peep Show podcast. I'm PJ Sage, and you can find me on Twitter at PeachSage.
And I'm Jessie Sage, and you can find me on Twitter at sapiotextual or at jessiesage.com.
We would like to remind you that we have a Patreon account and would appreciate your support. Please visit patreon.com/peepshowpodcast. Our music is courtesy of Joe Kennedy. The show was produced by Jessie and PJ Sage.
Signing off. Have a great week.